Now, I would like to introduce our two brilliant keynote speakers today, Fred Stella and Drishti May. Fred Stella serves on HAF's National Leadership Council with me. Fred is a pracharak for the West Michigan Hindu Temple. Fred is also the president of Interfaith Dialogue Association. He hosts a weekly radio program on religion and spirituality. It's called Common Threads, and it airs on a local NPR affiliate station. Our second keynote speaker today is Drishti May. Drishti is the president of the National Hindu Students Forum in the United Kingdom. It is the largest Hindu movement outside of India. Founded 29 years ago, the forum is active in almost half of all the universities in the UK. Through its activities, it reaches over 10,000 students every year. Drishti is a graduate in chemistry from the University of York. She now works in technology at Unilever in the UK. Folks, many of us here were born into Hinduism. Getting caught up in our day-to-day lives, it can be easy to overlook the profound richness of Hindu philosophy and all that it has to offer the world and to each of us individually. Sometimes we could use a reminder, perhaps from two folks who were not born into the tradition. Fred was born and raised a Catholic. Drishti was born and raised a Muslim. Both arrived to Hindu Dharma on their own through their own unconventional paths. For the next 20 minutes or so, let's hear from Fred and Drishti about their unique journeys. Following their conversation, we'll have a 10-minute moderated Q&A. Now, please pay attention to this part. The Q&A will be administered through the chat function only. Put your questions into the chat as Fred and Drishti are speaking, and we'll queue them up. For most of you, the chat is on the lower right side of the screen. Please press the question mark button first. It's the blue button you will notice. Then type your question in the box below that question mark and hit enter. We'll try and get to as many questions as we can after this. And now I'll turn it over to Fred and Drishti. So take it away, Fred.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. It's wonderful to be here. Namaste to everyone who is joining us, and namaste, Drishti. Good to see you again.
Namaste, Fred, and namaste, everyone tuning in. Real pleasure to join you from across the water.
Yes. So over the last couple of weeks, Drishti and I have gotten a chance to know one another through conversations like this, and I'm absolutely fascinated by her spiritual journey. So I'm going to ask her a couple of questions. She may ask me a couple of questions. It's interesting because the title of this is Unconventional Paths to Hinduism. And really, I thought there is only one conventional way to get to Hinduism, and that is to be born into it. And virtually every other way into the tradition is rather unconventional. Drishti, my first question to you is, do you remember your very first encounter secondhand with Hinduism? That is to say, hearing about it, learning about it in any way?
Yes, really great question. Thank you, Fred. So before actually even having any interaction with Hinduism, my very first interaction was within the madrasa. So this is something that I used to attend from the age of 5, where I would learn all that I needed to about Islam, but then also about the world that I occupied. And in there, there were many references, not only to what Hinduism is and what practices were contained within Hinduism that I should really stay clear of, but also of stories that glorified the destruction of idols. And they were stories that started from the age of 5 and throughout the time that I spent at madrasa. It was a recurring theme that came back and back again. So I'd grown up with this notion, with this idea that any form of imagery, any form of idols or idolatry as it was called, was haram, was illegal effectively and punishable as a consequence. And so that was my very first, I guess, taste or notion of what Hinduism in the UK might be like.
Interesting. Obviously, there was no indication that Hindus can also worship beyond form, beyond the murti. I find that it is fascinating that Hinduism tends to be defined by murti worship. And of course, for millions and millions of Hindus, murti worship is important. But that understanding that there is also this essence of spirituality, of divinity that goes beyond the murti, often doesn't get communicated.
No, of course. And I think it was when I was in school, and this is the story I probably shared with you when we were speaking before, where I had a teacher who set up something called the Good Values Club. Really lovely, looking to promote good character within young people. And I remember going to him maybe at the age of 6, 7, quite convinced that I knew Hinduism better than he did, where I told him, Hindus worship idols, and idols, they're just lumps of clay. What are you doing? And, he had such patience with me, such warmth, where he sought to explain that actually this is an ideal that reminds me of a higher self, of a higher ideal that I can inculcate in my life. And so it's just a reminder. I remember walking away from that being like, I'm sure he's wrong, because that's not what I've been taught within madrasa. And so the memes that I had that preceded that encounter were quite strongly rooted, which I guess made me a little bit more closed-minded to my very first encounters. What was it like for you, Fred? What was your first encounter or your first impression of Hinduism?
The first one that I remember, and it's possible that there was something that happened beforehand. Maybe it was studying geography in the 4th grade, but I don't remember that. What I remember, and honestly, this sounds rather cliche for people in my generation, but it was when the Beatles went to India, to Rishikesh, to take a months-long retreat at the Maharishi's ashram. For people who were not alive then, or people who were not in this country at that time, it was a profound cultural shift. All of a sudden, people who'd never heard about Hindu Dharma were intrigued. And I was about 11, 12 years old when that happened. And something just struck me. It was something that I can't explain. I just remember that event ignited something in me that encouraged me to think, someday I'm going to be doing something like that. And I had no idea how it would unfold. But that was the first time that there was a real interest. And I mean, I did nothing about it at that time. I was about, as I say, 11, 12 years old. But not long after that, around the age of 13, I started questioning my religion. And I loved being Catholic. I don't have any horror stories except, well, for a few cranky nuns back in grade school. But other than that, I was unscathed. And it was about, as I say, 13, where things just didn't make sense to me. So I just decided I wasn't going to believe in them. I didn't doubt the existence of God. I just doubted many of the dogmas. But I had nothing to replace it with. So I just sort of swept it under the rug. And it wasn't until 15 where I took a world's religions class in my Catholic high school. And my Catholic high school was very progressive. And so when the teacher taught about the different religions, she didn't teach from a standpoint of being demeaning. She was very excited when she taught Islam. She taught Islam with love and compassion. Judaism, the same thing. Hinduism, the same thing. But none of the other religions spurred me to study further. And when it came to Hinduism, yes, it encouraged me to actually visit a temple. So tell me about your first encounter with Hinduism, Drishti, your first positive first-hand experience. Was it studying a book? Was it being introduced to someone who might be a teacher?
So my very first And this memory, I think, came to me a few days ago, and it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's from around the age of about 5 years old. And I was with a family friend who was looking after me for the day, and I was spending time with her and her son. And she said, "Okay, now, Vita, we're going to go to the mandir." And my heart stopped. And my heart stopped because I knew that I wasn't allowed to do that. And I fumbled with my words, and I tried to tell her that actually I couldn't go. I'd wait in the car. I'd be fine on my own. She should go without me. And it was quite a scary experience getting to that point. And she laughed it off, and she said, "Don't worry, Vita, you'll be fine. We're only going to go in for a few minutes. We'll say a little prayer, and then we'll be on our way." And I don't remember exactly, but I must have mumbled something about not telling my mother as we entered the mandir, to which she must have laughed. But as we got there, it was not necessarily densely populated, not like how I experienced the mosque. There was no loud noise. There wasn't a sermon going on as such. It was quite quiet, quite peaceful. And we came to the front, and she then said to me, "Okay, Beta, you can just pray however you want, whatever you want to do. If you want to be quiet, if you want to make a wish, go for it." I remember sitting there, probably like a halfway house between folding my hands together and having my palms out. And I remember being there as this 5-year-old, begging for forgiveness for being in this place, begging for forgiveness for being in front of idols because I knew it was wrong, and saying, "Oh Allah, I am praying to you. I know I'm not meant to be here, but it's circumstance. I'm just here. I had no choice." And really, really quivering while this, and at the same time, obviously keeping an eye out to know when I could leave and when this family friend was leaving. And when we were ready to leave, we left. There was, it was at that moment that we were going to the exit that I thought, oh, this is truly different. No one corrected how I sat. No one told me how to pray. When I pray namaz, someone might be there correcting the posture of my toes or telling me that I'm not facing exactly in the right direction. None of that happened. It was so easy, and no one really cared about how I did my prayer. And as we left, there was an older gentleman that just gave us a little sweet. And again, it was just such a positive experience and such a contrast, I guess, to what I was used to going to the mosque on a regular basis. So that would be my very first memory that I can recall.
That's quite a beautiful one. What happened with me is I'm taking this world religions course, and as I say, it spurred me to learn more. The only really significant expression of the Dharma in Detroit, Michigan, where all of this is taking place, in 1970, the only real place is ISKCON. They already had a temple up. And of course, especially at that time, they had a real big publicity machine. They would have Sankirtan on the main drag downtown, and they would gather a lot of interest. And so I went to their Sunday feast. There's a feast after, of course, they have bhajans, they have kirtan, they have a discourse on the Gita and all of that. And I just remember how easily I fell into everything, that I didn't have the same issue that you did in terms of, oh, I'm in this foreign place and it's a sin. And of course, the good thing about growing up Catholic as opposed to Protestant is that we have statuary, and so having a statue of Krishna or a statue of Lord Chaitanya on an altar was no big deal for me, because I grew up with statues of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and a pantheon of saints. So there was no real issue for me there. And during the Gita discourse, it just resonated with me in such a tremendous way. And then in 1970, there really weren't a lot of options for non-Indians to have Indian food. I mean, there just weren't very many Indians in Detroit at that time. And so afterwards, the Sunday feast, I was eating food that I'd never eaten before in my life. And if the Gita discourse didn't get me, the prasadam certainly did. I've often said that if I ever record a commercial for Hinduism, the tagline would be, Hinduism, come for enlightenment, but stay for dinner. So I never joined ISKCON, but they did provide for me a foundation, some place to start. And it was a remarkable journey that started from there. Drishti, real quick, tell us about your how you separated from Islam, and was that a challenge in your community, in your family, etc.?
Sure. So one of the key ideas that I was exposed to quite early on was that Islam is the truth, and if you're born into the truth, how blessed are you? You've started at the right place. There are so many people that are born outside of Islam, and they may never know what Islam is. They may never find the right path. And that was deeply disturbing. Because if God is meant to be this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being, why would he do that? Why would he allow for this difference to occur? And then at the same time, if Islam really is the truth, I was convinced that I should be able to explore everything and then still return back to Islam and know that it is true. You know, if it's true, it should stand that test. And around the age of 11, so I think not too dissimilar to you, Fred, because I think you started inquiring in your early teens as well. Around the age of 11, I started asking these questions a bit more pronounced. I started asking, why am I not allowed to go and experience Buddhism? Why can I not go experience Christianity? Why can I not know what it means to be Hindu? And see Islam from that perspective, but also see truth from that perspective. And then decide for myself what is true. Why is that not allowed? Or can I do that? You know, is it permissible? Will I be forgiven for going out of the fold for a few years, but then, you know, coming back with such a strong faith? And I consulted someone, so a Maulana, so someone who'd done their equivalent of a master's and a PhD in Islam, who'd studied in Iran. And the response I got back was quite stern, quite firm, about bringing shame upon the family, about, you know, almost being devil-like, like being influenced by the wrong ideas and being very careful about who I shared those questions with. That was quite firm, and I was 11. So firm so that within a few months, my mother sent me off without either of my parents to Iran for a month to learn more about Islam, because she was so worried I'd turn out to be a terrible Muslim. And having had those experiences, having, you know, gone to Iran to learn more about Islam, coming back, I still could not be convinced that this was true. Why is it that there was such a difference for, you know, for Muslims and non-Muslims? Why was it that there were so many rules? You know, let's not kid ourselves. Islam is intense. Why were there so many rules for women? Where was equality? There were so many questions around, am I racist? How can I discriminate like this? How can I be phobic against other religions? How is this fair? You know, how can I be part of this world and, you know, hold these views? And so these questions kept fermenting. The desire to become vegetarian, to explore philosophy, I guess, grew and grew and grew to the point where I gained the confidence to say that I'm leaving Islam. And that was around the age of 17, where I said, enough is enough. And, you know, I've had my highs, I've had my lows. Islam's not the answer for me. And so I actually started off slightly differently in that I stayed in that agnostic/atheistic fold for quite a while before I then started exploring Hindu Dharma a few years later.
That is a challenge in life that so many people have. I think I was a bit more fortunate. Admittedly, when my parents found out at the age of 15 that I was exploring, they were a bit concerned. I remember something my mother said. It stuck with me all these years. She reminded me of a cousin of mine who was quite a bit older. He was probably 20 years older than I. And he had gone to the college that I would end up at, the University of Detroit, which is Catholic. It's run by the Society of Jesus, which is a highly intellectual order. And she remembers that my cousin took a philosophy class there. And many of the philosophy classes were taught by non-Catholics and some by people who were probably atheists. And she remembers that it got my cousin questioning, like it was a bad thing, similar to what you were told. Like, oh, you got to be careful what you read because you might question something. And at the age of 15, I knew that was not the attitude to have. And so I completely dismissed it. And so when I was busted for exploring Hindu Dharma, I just went underground. I just did it behind their back. And I never repented. I don't know what karma I may have accumulated for disobeying my parents like that, but I didn't care. So tell us about your life now. How do you express Hindu Dharma in your life, Drishti?
So thank you. So much of what you were saying, I guess, in your journey is relatable. I just wanted to express that even if we've had different journeys to where we are now, there's so much that resonates in terms of those different milestones that we reach when looking for the truth. Today, I'm really fortunate, and sometimes I say that I'm lucky with joy, and sometimes I say I'm lucky with a bit of a heavy heart, because I'm fortunate to have been born in this country. I'm fortunate that I was able to leave Islam and only have to, I guess, put up with deconditioning rather than anything worse. So I think that the reason why I start with that is because that gratefulness, that appreciation of that really does spur me on, I think, in my journey today. So today, when I look at Dharma, it feels so natural. It feels intuitive, that which sustains, that which is sustainable. My goodness, feeling at one with all living things, being able to respect the earth, being able to actually now practice not only vegetarianism, but be a vegan. That was something that was not even permitted to me growing up. I was forced to eat meat once every 40 days. So being able to continually learn, continually evolve, ask questions, but be part of not only a culture, but a tradition where questioning is key, evolution is key, and ensuring that I'm a net contributor to the world with positivity, that my actions are sustainable. It makes for a rather beautiful way of living through this life. So for me, that's in my personal life. I'm fortunate enough to be part of the National Hindu Students Forum, but also to be part of, I guess, a wider community here in the UK, the Hindu community, which, hats off to them, have truly embraced me. There's been no necessarily discrimination from where I've come from, but they've embraced my journey and they've embraced who I am. I'd really love to hear about how you express Dharma in your everyday and what your journey, I guess, after leaving Catholicism was like as well.
Well, much of what you just said, of course, resonates with me, especially the idea of constantly exploring, constantly questioning, being able to come up with an answer to a question that perhaps I'd answered 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but the answer no longer satisfies me. And so I can come up with a new answer if that seems more intuitively and logically correct. When I give lectures, I often say that Hinduism is not a faith-based faith. Now, mind you, we do acknowledge faith is a virtue, but we are not required to have faith in any particular religious or spiritual point. We can disagree vastly on any number of issues, but we acknowledge that we're both Hindu and that there's no answer, no belief is going to get God angry at us. And so we can move on. I find it wonderful that I have friends who are Hindu I've known for 20, 30 years, and we never ask one another about what we believe. So that ability to come to the truth as we see it, I find it a tremendous gift. The way I express Dharma, other than trying to be a nice person and focusing on how I am a part of the whole, how I have something to contribute, is mainly through meditation and devotional practices such as chanting and scriptural study, Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, actually, that combines meditation, selfless service, and the devotional practices and the accumulation of wisdom, all of those things, studying Vedanta, and being a part of a community. I'm actually a part of 2 different communities here in Michigan, and I'm active in both. As mentioned by Rajiv, I'm the pracharak for the temple. And one thing I wanted to ask you real quick is, you are now bilingual. That is to say, I'm sure that you could make a presentation on Islam and be very correct on it. Am I right? You know Islam.
I'd be correct on my experience and my study, yes.
And of course, you know Hindu Dharma. I'm bilingual in a sense too, because I speak Christian and I speak the Dharma. And my Christian upbringing has really allowed me to, I believe, be an effective speaker for the Dharma, because 90% of the audiences, the people who come to the temple and take tours, or the colleges where I often lecture, they're Christian. And so being able to use the nomenclature, to be able to compare the rituals, compare the core belief systems and all of that, has been a great, great gift to me. And so when I am in that teaching mode, that is one of my favorite ways to express Dharma. And I'm always able to find people who come up and afterwards, and anybody who does any teaching in public will say the same, that somebody comes up and says, that really resonates with me. I'm a Christian, or I'm a Jew, or I'm this, or I'm that, but that really resonates with me. And of course, that's a blessing. Hi, Rajiv.
Hello. As the 2 of you were speaking, the caricature I was drawing of myself was that of a Hindu listening to Beatles and walking into the halfway house for sweets and standing and sitting whichever way I like. No, but in all seriousness, thank you, Fred, and thank you, Drishti. That was quite an insightful and honest conversation. So as the 2 of you were talking, questions have been pouring in. Again, folks, if you wish to submit a question, please click the question button on the bottom right first, and then type in your questions. So Drishti and Fred, how about we take about 10 minutes to get through some of them? Fair enough?
Sure.
All right, so let's queue up the questions. So this question is for both you, Drishti, and Fred. How did you both go about learning about Hindu Dharma? Archana is asking, I was born into Hinduism, but I'm married to a Catholic man, and because I was born into it, it often feels too big to explain. My faith is something I would like to imbue in our future children, but I'm finding it hard to figure out how to go about that. So that's a question from Archana.
Fred, would you like to go first?
Okay, well, the first thing that I would say is we are very fortunate to live in a time now where so much material is available, and it's available by Hindu scholars and rishis, where we no longer have to deal with Indologists from the 19th and early 20th centuries who are trying to explain it for us. We have the works of Swami Vivekananda. We have the works of Sri Sri Paramhansa Yogananda and Prabhupada and Shivananda, all of these wonderful, wonderful saints who often wrote for people raised in the West. So I would highly recommend getting as many resources as possible from different schools of Hinduism. And it's just so easy to do that. Another thing, of course, some temples do have instruction, others do not. And there are many different sanghas all over the world, such as the one I belong to, Self-Realization Fellowship, also known as Yogoda Satsanga Society in India, the Vedanta Society, the Chinmaya Mission, ISKCON. I would recommend finding if there's anything local there and if there is any way to take classes. And in that way, aside from sitting in a makeshift classroom and hearing lectures, the ability to form a one-on-one relationship with a spiritual counselor, I think would be a wonderful idea. Real quick, in terms of how did I, well, that is how I not ultimately, but that in my initial stages, I read as much as I possibly could. And finally, when I embraced Paramhansa Yogananda's Sampradaya as my Sampradaya, I took a home study course for 4 years, and that was invaluable. But there are many, many different channels, and they're readily available. And my gosh, all of the lectures on YouTube, you could keep that up for years.
I guess I don't have too much to add after such an eloquent response, but I think the one thing that I would say is that the beauty of our tradition is that you have many ways open to you to learn, right? So the traditional is getting a book or doing some study. It could also be through experience. It could also be through bhakti. It can be through meditation. And I think the different yogas that are available to us are beautiful because they recognize that we all learn in different ways. And so from my experience, what we try to do for students in the UK is to be able to have those different paths to the same truth, to the same information available. I absolutely really echo what Fred said earlier, like a guru, a teacher, someone who's, just a step ahead really does help within your inquiry as well. Something great that we have in the UK is some of our Pracharaks lead morning Gita classes or different Advaita Vedanta classes, and they're great to attend as well. Anything that works for you is definitely the right thing to do.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Nishant Limbakia. This is again for Drishti and Fred both. Drishti and Fred, would you say someone coming from Abrahamic faiths would have to go through some sort of atheistic existence, for lack of a better word, before they embrace Dharma fully?
Drishti, why don't you go first this time?
Sure. So I can speak, I guess, from a Muslim perspective. And if you are coming from Islam and you are exiting Islam, taking that next step to a tradition like Hindu Dharma is really difficult, because not only do you have to let go of Islam, which is intense, which is scary, and it's an active process. It's not just a I'm done and I'm out. There's an active deconditioning process that has to take place. So not only do you have to go through that, but then you also have to counteract all the rhetoric you've heard about different traditions, all the rhetoric about how, Hinduism isn't necessarily aligned with science. It isn't correct. It has backward practices. So for me, it was definitely the way I went about it. It was definitely right for me because it was such a transition. I have heard stories of people going from one to the other, but I would say that depending on your upbringing, depending on your initial experience, it can be very hard to go without that in-between atheistic / agnostic experience.
Couple of things. First of all, I recommend everybody become an atheist. Everybody, no matter what tradition, for at least 5 minutes, maybe 10. Here's why I say that. Let's say your closet is a mess and you've got a lot of junk in there that needs to get out. How do you clean a closet? Do you go in with a flashlight and work around everything? Of course not. What you do is you take everything out. You start with a bare, naked closet. And now all that stuff is outside. And what you do is you put everything into piles, right? What's going to charity? What are you going to keep? what really needs to be thrown away because it's so moth-eaten. All of these different things, and then you might buy new stuff too. So then everything that needs to go back into the closet will go back. The new clothes, the clothes that are still good, and then the rest you go away. So if someone was to say, okay, this worldview, this ideology is not serving me, try to get rid of everything and then bring in what serves you at that time. And so it's a good question. Is there a divinity? Is there something that we call God or Brahman or Ishvara? And then move in what is comfortable for you. Now, I did not go through that, and I think it was because I had certain experiences at a young age that disallowed me from ever embracing atheism or agnosticism. But I know that it can be very helpful for many people, and I love being a part of a tradition that acknowledges and accepts people who cannot cognize the existence of a divinity outside the natural world. I think that having that freedom is a wonderful, wonderful thing to have.
Thank you. Let's queue up the next question. So this question comes from Shobha Rao. She says, "Thank you, Fred and Drishti, for your wonderful talk. Fred, I was wondering how you used your bilingual skills to talk with school groups on their temple visits. What points did you dwell on?"
I always start my talks by saying that if you are going to present on a religion that the other person knows nothing of, there are two points that you have to lay out very quickly. Otherwise, you don't have context for the rest of it. The first one is, what is divinity? How do you understand divinity to be? What do you call divinity, God, whatnot? And the second is, what is our relationship with divinity? Is there a relationship to be had altogether? So I always start with those. Then I move into when I say the relationship with divinity, then we talk about Atman. Atman is Brahman. I'm very clear up front about what the differences are. And so I talk about how people in the Abrahamic traditions, unless they're in a mystical branch of that tradition, they understand God to be separate from God's creation. So I'm upfront about the fact that I say oftentimes, a Christian might say that God is in this room. And they all nod, say yes. But a Hindu would say God is this room. And I try to explain that. In terms of what we may have together, what we share in common, I always talk about our moral codes, the fact that for the most part, what we would consider adharmic, a Christian would consider sinful. And if they're Catholic or Orthodox, I talk about how we both use images in our worship. We can use images in our worship. I talk about the similarity between what they call the Eucharist or communion or Lord's Supper, the bread and wine at the end of a service, and how we offer prashad. So those are the points that I often I hit a lot. There's others, but with scant time, those are the first things that come to mind.
Thank you, Fred. How about we take one last question, if it queues up. So this question comes from Akshaya. She says, "Namaste all, tuning in from the UK, and wonderful to hear this dialogue. I would love to hear from both panelists, how can we continue to impart the pluralistic aspect of Hindu Dharma beyond the box of religion that it is viewed when comparing it to the Abrahamic faith groups?"
Your turn, Drishti.
Sure, no problem. So great question, thank you. I think the first thing that is really important is our language. So, in any discussion, the first thing we do is define our terms. What do we mean by religion? Is what we are discussing as Hindu Dharma a religion or not? Is it a faith? Is it not? How does faith fit into it? So, really defining our terms and being really clear on that. And then I think we need to bring that into any discussion that we have, whether it's interfaith, whether it's something else, whether it's just general discussions. So be really clear on our terms, because there are so many terms that have been mistranslated. I could be talking about Bhagwan and somebody could be saying, well, that means God, and our ideas of God are very different. So let's really clarify our terms and have that linguistic hygiene. And then when it comes to pluralism, I think it is to live it and to breathe it. Can I entertain an idea that I do not agree with, but allow you to complete your idea, critique it, maybe even, implore a Purva Paksha, where I try and see it from your perspective and see if I learn something new from that experience? Can I have that level of acceptance in my everyday living, in my dialogue, and then encourage you to do the same? And what we find, or what I found, is that whilst I was at university, I could talk about the Mahabharata, I could talk about the Ramayana, and I lived with two Presbyterian Christians. They would leave the room. They wouldn't be willing to engage in conversation. However, when they would talk about Christianity, I'd be very happy to have that discussion, be very happy for them to quote the Bible at me, and then for me to ask further questions in that dialogue. But it wasn't a mirrored relationship, it was very different. And I think for us to be able to encourage it, we have to do it, but then we also have to be able to show light to where it is not happening. So where we are met with resistance, or where we are met with thoughts that are exclusive in nature, where our voice isn't heard, or where pluralism isn't allowed to flourish, let's throw light to it and ask the question why. And I think the more we do that, the more we draw light to it, the more we'll start to uncover or unearth I guess the topsoil that will allow then for this sort of discussion to take place.
Thank you, Drishti. I would say that pluralism permeates the soul of the Dharma, that you can't have the Dharma without pluralism. And so someone who may be an adherent, who is not practicing pluralism, who is not advocating pluralism, doesn't really have a good understanding of it. Now, pluralism is often misunderstood. Some people are afraid it means all religions are alike, that there really are no differences. And I am quick to correct that understanding, that misunderstanding. Although, and I mentioned this before, I mentioned the mystical traditions of some religions. If you get a Sufi, a Gnostic Christian, a Kabbalah practicing Jew in a room along with a Hindu, oftentimes there's very little to disagree on. But what I really try to share with people, say in the Abrahamic faiths, is that just because I may disagree with what they believe, it doesn't mean that it is the wrong answer. Meaning, that's not quite the way what I meant to say. They don't lose points with God because they might believe something that is erroneous. The same way that I don't believe I lose any brownie points with God if I happen to have a belief that isn't quite on the money. And so if we move through life with that attitude and we encourage that in our conversations, I think we're doing our jobs.
Okay, folks, that's about all the time we have for Q&A today. We apologize if we didn't get to your questions, but we want to be mindful of the time. Fred, Drishti, thank you again for joining us today. I think you're both leaving us with a deeper appreciation for the wealth and wisdom that Hinduism has to offer.